Hi guys, good morning. It's Friday, November the 22nd. We're very glad to be here. Thank you, Lara, for inviting us to share this amazing opportunity to reflect upon such an important, intriguing topic as self-doubt. I am Luigi Fassi. I work as an art curator. I direct the Man Contemporary Art Museum in Sardinia, Italy. And I have the pleasure to be here with Cristina, Giuseppe, and Alessandro. We all come from kind of different backgrounds, so I think it's a good starting point to kind of briefly introduce ourselves. So I'll pass it on to Cristina.
So, I'm Cristina Travanini. I'm a researcher and a curator. I'm interested in philosophy, curatorial practices, and creative processes. And
Okay.
Giuseppe.
So I'm Giuseppe di Salvatore. I was trained as a philosopher, working in research in the university, and then I switched to video journalism in Switzerland. I live in Basel, and in 2016 I founded with Rodbetic an online platform with filmexplorer.ch that is entirely dedicated to moving images between art and cinema. And so I work there as do interviews and as art and film critic.
Right, and I am Alessandro Salice, and I am a lecturer in philosophy at UC Cork. And actually, perhaps I should say that we do not have different backgrounds because we are all philosophers.
Yeah.
This is true. I mean, I wanted to stress this out. I mean, we do share this background, although we went, different paths.
directions. Yeah.
Exactly.
But we do share this background. Yeah,
Right,
definitely.
and well, I work on several topics, but I guess my main research field is philosophy of mind and especially philosophy of emotion. And I was wondering, perhaps we could, start the discussion by, trying to figure out what exactly self-doubt is. And in fact, partly maybe because I am currently doing work on that, I'd like to suggest that, self-doubt might be described as a kind of emotion, indeed, and specifically maybe as what is sometimes called a self-conscious emotions. Now, let me give you just an example of what I mean by self-conscious emotions. So shame, or pride, or self-esteem are usually called self-conscious emotions because not really because they involved any kind of reflection or any the performance of or let's say the activation of any particular sophisticated cognitive skill, but just because in shame, for instance, it seems that you're always ashamed of yourself, right? Or in pride, when you're proud of something, pride is something that is about yourself, and similarly self-esteem, as the name already suggests. So I was wondering whether indeed self-doubt couldn't be described as a self-conscious emotion, in the sense that when you are self-doubting, you are in a particular affective state that is about yourself. In fact, if I can push the conjecture a little bit further, I think it makes sense to say that we are all Italian native speakers. We are not, none of us is an English native speaker, and in fact, the moment in which you start thinking about yourself talking in a different language, you start to become unsure. Am I all right with my English? Am I doing good? And when you do that, that it's not simply that you are calculating or computing any particular belief that you are somehow assessing the probability that you are doing things in a good or wrong way, but rather you are really feeling something. You are feeling that sense of insecurity, right? And that sense of insecurity, I'd like to contend that sense of insecurity is about yourself. So just as, for instance, shame is about yourself, or pride is about yourself. So that was, as a way of introducing this a discussion on this actually difficult but also tantalizing topic.
I would like to say, just to understand better this point you are doing now. I mean, in pride or shame, you don't say self-shame or self-pride. You can say it, of course, but in order to stress the fact that the shame is directed to or concern yourself. But with self-doubt, you say self-doubt. You just say doubt.
Yes.
And so, do you think that there is something specific just because of the fact that in the notion of self-doubt, the word self is there?
Right.
I don't know.
No, I think that's a very valuable point. Maybe here an analogy with esteem could perhaps help. So if I esteem, say, Luigi or Cristina or Giuseppe, of course I'm again, I think, in an affective state that is directed to you. I mean, I suppose I esteem Giuseppe because he is such a nice guy, and I really admire him. But this doesn't exclude that esteem could also be self-directed, that I could also esteem myself. And in that particular case, again, I think you are in an affective state, right? So I think you're absolutely right that doubting or doubt more generally does not have to be directed to yourself, but it can. And indeed, I don't know. I mean, this is also something that we have discussed in preparation of this meeting. I mean, the difficulty of rendering the notion of self-doubt into Italian. It seems that we do not have an equivalent of that term into Italian. I guess this is to say that in fact perhaps it's, we need conceptual tools in order to precisely pinpoint what is it that makes doubt self-doubt, right?
No, it's a good point because I think we all share this concern about how are you to translate this into Italian. Being all of us native Italian speakers speaking in English, I think it's been a kind of interesting starting point in the very last days. Yeah. So because I think in Italian it can have like a slightly different meaning, meaning something which can be translated as a very openly critique towards yourself. So like really putting yourself into question,
right,
in a way which is going into a sort of negative meaning, more or less.
No, that's I think that is noteworthy. Yeah, I mean, I guess perhaps couldn't one say this is yet another suggestion? Couldn't one say that maybe there are two forms of self-doubting? One in which it's the attitude is very explicit and it is in a sense. The presence of yourself in the attitude is very thematic, as you were saying, right? You are questioning yourself, and that is a kind of active engagement with who you are. And then you have this other, slightly pre-reflective or less thematic kind of self-doubt, the one that I was mentioning previously, right? That kind of insecurity that you had or that you have when you start to speak in another language, right?
So if I understand, that's why you propose emotion as a specific form of self-doubt thing. You think self-doubt as an emotion.
Yeah.
Maybe the first way to consider self-doubt, as you said, it's more intentional.
Yeah.
Like self is more thematized.
Yes.
And the second way to describe it is more as an attitude, maybe.
Yeah, possibly.
Which actually is also very healthy to have.
Yeah.
It's not also that negative.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very good point. I mean, suppose somebody's entirely immune to self-doubt. I mean, come on, what kind of guy would that be, right? You don't want to engage with somebody like that.
Sounds more like a cyborg.
Exactly.
This is an interesting point, actually. Can a
Cyborg.
robot or an artificial intelligence
engage with self-doubt?
Perhaps in the second sense.
I doubt it.
Yeah.
Well, the question would be like, can a cyborg or a robot like have emotions?
Yes.
Because if you define self-doubt as a kind of a self-consciousness emotion, then the question is, can a cyborg have emotions at all? Or not?
It's not maybe only a question of emotions, but also of freedom.
Yeah.
Because I mean, self-doubt is also connected to
Well, yeah, the
freedom.
freedom of putting yourself into
Exactly.
question, as you were saying
I
before.
mean,
Right.
yeah, freedom to choose between different options,
Right.
Yeah.
and maybe also freedom not to choose. I mean,
Right. I mean, I guess perhaps you can design a robot that is able to compute, states, and but whether a robot can really feel emotions, I mean, in the sense that there is something
feeling
there that you
insecure,
feel
yeah.
like. I think that is. I mean, at least it's an open question. It's an empirical question, and not.
Of course, we should define emotion because
Yeah.
I mean, the fact of being confronted with oneself,
Yeah.
I think it's not a problem for an artificial intelligence
No,
machine.
I think
Because
yeah.
actually, with the neuronal system, that is a theory that started already in the 80s.
Yeah.
The fact that a system is actually is constantly confronted with all the data that he has and is going to develop, or she's
Right.
it's going
Right.
to develop. So
Right.
there is a constant confrontation with
Right.
itself, and so this not more. It's not a question of being confronted with itself,
Right.
or with oneself. It's more a question of, I don't know, the emotional point. That's
Exactly.
I would like to know a bit more about what you think
About emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, just come back to your example. I found very interesting the example of speaking a foreign language.
Yeah.
In which sense you think that this uncertainty that you have speaking
Yeah.
in a foreign language should be described as an emotion?
Right.
And not just as a, I don't know, that the fact that you state that
Right.
you are not able
Right.
to say the same thing. This is just an objective statement,
Right.
objective
Right.
consideration.
Right.
Why you speak in terms of emotion?
Right.
What is there? What is the
Right.
emotional part of the?
Okay, right. That's a very difficult question. I mean, it really goes to the core of many disciplines. But okay, so here's one idea, right? So I think the kind of comparison that you're trying that you like me to run is about emotions or affective states on the one hand, and then what beliefs or beliefs analogs. And here's an example, right? Suppose, I mean, at the moment we have each of us has plenty, has plenty of beliefs. The year in which you were born. That Rome is the capital of Italy. You might know when is the boiling point of water. All that is in your head somehow, but that doesn't feel like anything. But now compare these with a case in which you have been shamed by somebody, or you feel ashamed because somebody has perceived a faulty aspect of your personality. Damn, that's a very different kind of state you're in, right? There you want to hide, you want to escape, you feel like miserable. And I think that sort of uncertainty that accompanies self-doubt could be described. I mean, of course, it's a completely different quality, right? What it is like to feel uncertainty is completely different from what it is like to feel shame. But still, it's something that you feel in your body, something that, you have it in your gut. Or compare,
So to be more precise, probably
Yeah.
But I would like to come
Yeah.
back to the question of speaking a foreign language, which is a very good example, I think.
Yeah.
And so the idea, there is a presupposition that actually language, in this
Yeah.
case, is not just a part of myself, it's an essential part of myself. Because I think that's the big distinction, or the most important distinction we should probably draw, is the fact that, I mean, shame, for example, what is specific is that not that just that concern yourself in general, or a part of yourself. It could not concern, for example, something specific. I mean, I can be ashamed of, I don't know, the fact that I have, for example, an accident. I have no fingers in the right hand, so I can be ashamed of this. But that's a very specific things. And another thing is to be ashamed of oneself, like entirely. I mean, my personality, my being. So, so will be not important to probably to do this distinction, to say, okay, when we self-doubt, actually, is not just an emotion concerning something of ourselves, but concerning ourselves as an
As
entire
an agent, yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, okay, it's another way. Here's another thought that perhaps one might want to consider. So it seems that when you are self-doubting, you are putting yourself under certain standard of evaluations, right? You are telling yourself, okay, am I a person or an agent that is good enough to pull off, to deliver, right? Am I good enough to do this or that? And that I think is, I mean, it's revelatory in a way about who you are, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's also revelatory in two senses. In the first sense, because it tells something about how to evaluate your performance given certain standards, but also it tells something about how ambitious are you in setting your standards? What are your standards? Are very high? Are very low? And so I think self-conscious emotions, more in general, I think are excellent. They're an excellent tool to speak about something like the self, right? Which I know you're skeptical about the existence of, but yeah.
Well, but it opens up like a bunch of questions, like the pressure coming from society.
Yeah.
When it comes to setting the standards,
Yeah.
defining self-esteem. So there is a lot of agents coming from society,
Absolutely.
from the outside,
Yeah.
which are not kind of predetermined as
Absolutely.
such, but
Absolutely.
they are culturally defined.
Absolutely. And that is why I believe that our self is part and parcel of a larger social identity. So who we are is also partly defined by the groups or community to which we belong, and so by the way, we are discussing now cases of say shame that are directed to yourself, but of course you can be ashamed of somebody else, right? Here is an example. Suppose you have a son or a daughter, and he or she has to perform a concert in front of an audience, but he or she shows up drunk in front of the audience, right? And you are sitting in the audience. I think you will feel ashamed about him or her, right? And why is that? Why is it that? I mean, you have done nothing. Why being ashamed, right? It's a completely different individual. But I guess the point there is that that of course you identify with that person. Of course, this is part of who you are, right? Other individuals can be part of who you are. So I think you are right, Luigi, that in great many cases, the standard that we set for ourselves are standard that we inherit from groups or
I
societies.
discovered that in German there is a specific word for this, Fremdscham. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's probably just because in German the words are created
Combined.
combined. So.
Yeah.
But I found very interesting because that's another word very difficult to translate.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, you have to do a sort of paraphrase, but it's, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Point,
In if I may say, I mean, I'm not selling myself as an expert here, but interestingly, in Japanese, the words for shame is one that is can be assigned either to you or to the other, in an equal way. So it captures not only self-directed shame, but equally well Fremdscham, right? Cases where you are ashamed of somebody else. So, yeah.
Because actually, I would like to resist this this now, because now it's clear what is in your mind about the question of emotion, but I would like to resist because I have the impression that if there is a sort of presupposition in your point that the fact that the standard that I consider for myself define myself. Yeah. And I would like to resist because I mean, if you Google self-doubt, the first thing you discover is 10 ways to overcome or to get rid of self-doubt. Self-doubt is very negative notion because it's a question of self-confidence, self-esteem, and it's not good because we have to be confident with ourselves because
we have to be able to deliver.
Because we have to be able to deliver the performance.
It's like an obstacle.
So, I mean, I have the impression that the horizon is the idea that our performances, our capabilities, our way to cope with situation and to deliver and to get to the standards that the society or ourselves give. That becomes a bit too big or too important, and probably will be sort of liberation or sort of to say no. Okay, that's something. I can doubt, of course, of my ability. For example, now to be clear with you. So I probably am not clear enough speaking in English now with you. But that's not my personality. I mean, that cannot exhaust the definition of my personality. So this kind of self-doubt is a sort of local or sort of specific self-doubt. And I would like to think self-doubt more radically, where the self is not defined just from the standard. It's not defined from the expectation I can have for myself. And in this sense, probably emotional shame or pride are not probably the best example for self-doubt.
Okay. Did you want to say something? Or
No, I was thinking that defined like this, I mean, as a negative emotion, self-doubt is pretty close to the concept of confession somehow.
Okay.
Because it's a way to express your limits and identify your weaknesses.
Right. Now that's an interesting suggestion. Perhaps we should explore that a little bit more. So I mean, there is a sense in which perhaps we are all making some confessions here in this bunker, isn't it?
And the bunker is also
it's conducive to confess yourself.
Because it looks protective.
Yes.
Safe.
Yeah.
So, and as you said before, self-doubt is also a question of insecurity, and you're in a super safe place.
Yes.
But at the same time, our audio is recorded.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So that goes back to, I think, what Giuseppe was saying. I agree with him that, I mean, of course, there must be boundaries here, right? We must be able to say, okay, these emotions is unwarranted or unjustified. I'm not, because this is, I'm not evaluating myself based on my own criteria, so it is, as the philosophers say, heteronomic, right? But at the same time, I think your point, Cristina, is perfectly valuable here, where, I mean, yes, we are all talking here in this bunker, and it's only the four of us, but in fact there is the whole world potentially just hearing what we are currently
the
saying.
Elephant in the room.
Exactly. exactly. So
but I'm quite interested in your idea of confession. I mean, in which sense you think that self-doubt has something to do with confession? Or more about, because I mean, confession is more something that explain or exemplify the self or your personality. I mean, when you confess, when you say something, you are telling the truth, or anyway, you are trying to touch something very profound in you. And self-doubt, of course, is sort of opposite concept in the sense that if you doubt yourself, probably you doubt yourself because you want to touch something even deeper in your personality, or is a way to put in question the fact that your own personality is, I don't know. I'd like to know from you what was in your mind with this idea of confession.
I'd say that self-doubt maybe could be, but it's an open question. Can self-doubt also be considered as a first phase where you express your limits and you're aware of your weaknesses, and then once you realize and you're aware of this, you also think about how you can interpret your actions. So maybe you find out that what you are doing is wrong, and maybe it's not correct. And so at the same time you confess that you made a bad decision, maybe.
Can you make an example? I'm sure you have something that's happened maybe to you or to somebody else.
Actually, I have plenty of examples of self-doubt conducting to confession, but still, this is a betrayed confession by our audience.
But for example, I don't know if you are Catholic, but when you were a child, I don't know, no, never. I mean,
What?
I had experience to confess with a priest.
I mean, we've all been educated more or less
Yeah,
in a
so,
Catholic
and-
way. Yeah.
And I don't know, the experience to confess was for you an occasion to self-doubt, or I don't know.
I would say so.
Yeah.
I would say so. To reflect on what you did and
Yeah.
Yeah.
thinking back.
I think it's again like a kind of pressure coming from the society, because I mean, I think as Italians, I think more or less we had to cope
Yeah.
with that, you know, like confessing, going to church, like at least when we were kids, and you were sort of obliged to, according to, you know, Catholicism, to confess from time to time, yeah?
Right.
And I think it's something that was kind of awkward, because you were supposed to basically, you know, bring to the surface, it's in a sort of kind of public realm,
Right.
is this one-to-one confrontation with a priest, like kind of little secrets, or like things that you perceived were really bad, bad things you did yourself, or like things that you didn't think were bad, but you were supposed to think were bad, and therefore you had to
Yeah.
confess them according to the criteria that were set
Yeah.
upon you. So I think it was a kind of very rigid, monolithic way of confessing yourself, because you had to. So it was like a fiction somehow.
Yeah.
You
Right.
had to kind of openly sort of play the role of somebody, which you know,
It's kind of a narrative that
And
you
feel
are.
guilty.
it's
And
a
also a question of
predetermined kind
guilt.
of narrative. Yeah.
Yeah.
You had to act a little bit. Yeah. So like to kind of let's get rid of this by
Playing a
talking
role.
5 minutes. Playing the role of the one who confessed that he did this and that.
Right.
But still, I didn't completely understand the point, because I mean, I understand in confession the self is there. There's a question of self-communication or speaking about oneself.
Right.
But where is the specificity of doubting? I mean, is it real? Is it something that really you experience when you confess yourself, that you doubt of yourself? Because it could be also just a liberation. You feel guilty. You confess
Maybe
yourself.
It is both.
You are
I
happy.
think it is
you-
both.
There is no problem with doubting about yourself.
think
There is
it
no
is,
uncertainty with yourself. I mean,
Well,
I don't
well,
see the doubt. I
Well,
mean,
but when it's about confessing yourself, like in Christianity, according to Catholicism, at least the way we lived it through, I think it was like a twofold process. It was precisely like sort of self-doubting yourself in order to go through this kind of healing process and become like a better person somehow.
Okay, so the idea is that self-doubt is sort of
It's the trigger of
the trigger.
It's a
So
trigger
what
to
comes
a development
before
process,
the confession is sort of output
Yeah.
Yeah.
from.
The, the output, it's like becoming a better person by having got rid of like your sins somehow, and you can always only get rid of your sins by confessing them in
Right.
that specific context by
so
talking to a priest.
So the idea is that confession is actually a way to overcome self-doubt.
In
In a sense.
Yeah.
It's a kind of
At some
healing
point, yeah.
process. Yeah. Somehow it's about overcoming, but obviously you would always come back to doing sins
Yeah.
sooner or later. So it's a never-ending kind of process, which I think we're going into kind of an existential
Yeah.
thread now.
Yeah.
But the suggestion you did is very
But-
interesting, Cristina, about the betrayal. Because if we consider that, okay, we self-doubt, in order to confess, we have to self-doubt. The self-doubt, then we heal from this doubt, and we confess. But then, if we discover that this confession is betrayed,
Yeah.
for example, we discovered that the priest told my
No,
mother.
right, but that's
And the secret is broken, of
Yeah.
course.
The secret is because that's the situation. I mean, we are in a bunker,
Yeah.
we are speaking,
Yeah,
we are
exactly.
confess ourselves,
Yeah.
but there is the audio, there
Right.
is the other people now,
exactly.
and that's the betrayal,
Exactly.
and so
But then what about the famous literary genre of confessions, right?
Yeah.
Did St. Augustine really
Exactly.
confess, or Rousseau really confessed anything? It's hard to say. It's
I
very
doubt
hard to
it.
say. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, come
literary
on.
operations. In the
Yeah,
end.
I think they all had an audience in their mind,
Yeah.
right?
No, for sure.
This is
for
a good
sure.
point. The
Yeah.
audience,
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
because when you self-doubt or you confess something, I mean, what
Yeah,
is
an
the
audience.
audience?
But it's
Like
such an
yourself
interesting
again.
process. I mean, it's such an interesting point, Alessandro, because I think it's something that we can say it's at the very core of Western identity. Yeah, like the idea that you have to confess, you have to go through a personal struggle process,
Yeah.
like a kind of healing process again, to sort of develop
Yeah.
yourself. And St. Augustine and Rousseau are two fantastic examples, but there is another, I think, let's say tradition, which can be brought to the table, the tradition of the Bildungsroman, maybe, the
Right.
kind of this
Did you get
genre.
translate as
Well, yeah, you can translate it as this kind of
formation? I don't know, education.
well, you
And
know,
that's interesting
Bildung,
to-
it's a
yeah.
kind of impossible
Yeah.
word to translate into other language. I mean, here we go again.
Yeah.
Translation. So even Bildung, it's like, yeah, self-education, maybe. Yeah, this is maybe in English the best way to
Or
translate
also
it.
self-development.
Self-development as well. Yeah, yeah. So I think there is, as we all know, like a huge genre, which is basically the Bildungsroman genre going through Western literature, and I think we can name, I think, at least like, you know, among the most important names, like I would say Wilhelm Meister by Goethe, the Buddenbrock by Thomas Mann, Adalbert Stifter, or Green Henry, the Green Heinrich by Gottfried Keller, which is a quite iconic, I think, piece of literature in that respect.
Can you tell us something about the story of the Green Henry?
Yeah, why not? I mean, the Green Henry, it's the story of a guy that basically grows up with his mother. So his father passed away, and so he grows up with a widowed mother, and he develops certain artistic talents. So he basically realized by years passing by that he wants to be an artist. And his mother agrees basically. So she sends it to like a few artisans, like arts and craft people in a small Swiss village, precisely where you grew up, in order to kind of develop this kind of artistic talents. And I think by years passing by, something happens, because basically he decided to be an artist. So, and he even moves out of Switzerland to be in Munich, which back then was like an artistic capital, so like the place to be in order, you know, to at least try to be a professional artist, you know, engage with a large community of artists there.
Right.
And basically, so he becomes an artist for sure, but he's never able to kind of achieve what he was supposed to achieve. So to become, for instance, economically independent as an artist, able to maintain himself. So basically, there is this clash described by Keller between the will of being an artist and the pressure coming from the society to be from the bourgeoisie, you know, to be like a good citizen, you know, in Switzerland. So he drives away from that by moving out, by moving to Germany, settling in Munich, and he fails at the end of the day as an artist.
He fails.
He fails because he's not able to kind of deliver the kind of, according to the standards of the time, in order to become economically independent, in order to really kind of enter the art system back then. So there are two versions, quite interestingly, of Gottfried Keller's novel. So in the first one, he fails completely, goes back to Switzerland, and his life is miserable. So because he failed, and there is this also kind of judgment coming from the bourgeoisie, the Swiss bourgeoisie. That guy left the country, wanted to be something else, wanted to be an artist, failed, came back, and now he has to be punished.
Right.
He's kind of rejected. In the second version, which I think gives you an idea of a struggle Gottfried Keller himself had to go through, because it's pretty autobiographical, I think, as a novel. Gottfried Keller basically provides a different kind of narrative, because Heinrich does go back to Switzerland, but because of the struggles he had to go through, because of the failure he experienced, because also the kind of struggle of the clash between the will of being an artist and the pressure coming from his society to be something else, meaning like a bourgeois, basically, with a kind of decent job, he goes back. And he becomes like a public administrator of his region in Switzerland. He becomes the head of the district, so he becomes like a morally sophisticated person, somebody that, because of the struggles he had to cope and go through, has now the capability to be like a political representative of his society. He's
So in a
somebody
way, it
with
was a failure as an artist. But
exactly. So he achieved a higher moral status.
But in
And then
another
exactly.
field,
At the end of the day, he becomes a citizen, like a bourgeois citizen, but somebody able to really, with a higher moral standard, which makes him like a better person,
So
like a wise guy at the end of the day, one able to lead his own community.
Yeah. So this is just out of curiosity. So actually there are two versions of the books?
There are two versions of the book. In the first one, quite interestingly, Gottfried Keller is let's say, much more severe, because I think you can really see like the pressure coming from the bourgeoisie, from the society in the first version. So he goes back, but he failed and is not able to achieve like a better status. Whereas in the second version, like the kind of self-dubbed kind of process he had to go through, it's in a dialectic kind of way, becomes the way to become like a better person. Like you go through this development process, and only because of that, had he not been able to go through such a process of failure, of self-doubt, then he would have not been able to become like a civic servant, like somebody even able to lead his community at the very end of the day.
And so we are going to another direction, another concept of self-doubt. I mean, this is very positive. I mean, self-doubt can be not only negative, but
No, exactly. I
very
think
powerful outcome in the end. I mean, it's a way to explore yourself and new ways of being yourself.
It's again a kind of healing process. I mean, we can even go a little bit farther by claiming that precisely this self-development process is at the core of the Western society. Because I mean, we said St. Augustine, but St. Augustine, you can read it as a Bildungsroman, the Confessions. I mean, absolutely. I mean, you can read it in an existential way. So,
but for you, just to understand better, the point of the self-doubt is in the process of self-education or Bildung, or the main point is more that the fact that at the end it fails, there is the self-doubt.
I think
I mean, the self-doubt is because after this process you are in a sort of puzzlement, you don't know where to go, you don't know what is your existence, your character, or is really during the process?
I think it's ingrained in the process, but from the very beginning, because at least in Keller's Green Heinrich case, the self-doubt is at the very beginning, because when he has to kind of understand, by determining to be an artist, he has to understand that he's going through a clash, precisely between the will of being an artist, which means driving away from what he was supposed to be, like a decent Swiss citizen, but maybe in order to achieve a better life, he should have become like a lawyer or like an artisan or like something like this. But being an artist was back then, and maybe still nowadays, something that would make your parents not sleep well.
Right. But this is interesting, because it means that you have. I mean, if I followed your reconstruction, it seems that the hero of the novel starts acting based on a certain self-image, on an image that you have formed about who you are and what you want to achieve and what you think is good for you and what is good in general. And then you go through a process of self-alienation, if you wish. So you have to give up on your self-image, thanks to the self-doubt that has emerged through time, and you alienate from yourself. I mean, in a sense, you have to become somebody else, right? You
Actually,
have
that is the romantic idea of Erfahrung, erfahren, the idea of traveling, of the philosophy of wandern. In the German philosophy, that's exactly. I don't know. I think it's an historical point. I mean, not an historian, but it could be interesting to think also the fact that subjectivity is a sort of product of modernity. In the modern era, the subject becomes something like very important, and then in the Romantic period, where exactly the Bildungsroman comes from. Was a moment where this subjectivity is probably put in question, exactly in the sense that you are you have to build again. It's no more something given.
Yes.
Because the model of
Exactly.
education of the Enlightenment
Yes.
is probably not enough
Yes.
to get the very point or the
Right.
essence of your personality. And then the only way is to find out, because I mean in the Bildungsroman there is always exactly this idea to travel, to go away to move out
exactly,
from your
yeah.
place, to discover, to be open to new experience, something that comes, that happens and that is not
Yeah.
planned. So it's a specific self-education, very far from a plan of education. It's
Yeah.
no plan,
It's
actually.
informal somehow.
It is totally informal, yeah.
Yeah.
And so in this sense, it's this very progressive attitude,
Yeah.
self-doubting in the Bildungsroman. I think it's exactly this idea that you transform yourself. That's why my question, because I think it's very important to put the self-doubt in the process, even if we want to read the roman from the novel from
by Keller.
Keller, is the very point of self-doubt is in the process and not at the end. So what is most interesting is not probably
No,
the
absolutely,
the end
because
of
the end is a kind of happy end.
Interesting,
I mean,
yeah.
in the
Yeah,
second version,
Yeah.
second version, as I pointed out, yeah.
And so maybe self-doubt, if you consider it also in the framework of the process, as a phase, the self-doubt has its own beginning and an end also.
Right.
It's also
So, yeah, I mean, I
important
think
to-
there is this idea that when you live through a crisis, eventually you have a better judgment, precisely because you have lived that through, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
At the end, at the very end of the day, it is precisely this. yeah,
Right.
in 2 words. So
Right,
it's,
and self-doubt is core to any crisis, any existential crisis one might have. Is when your self-image is going to crumble, it's going
yeah, yeah.
to
And
dissolve.
any growing process.
Yeah,
Also,
yeah,
as
yeah,
a consequence, I
Yeah.
would say. So you go through a crisis,
yeah,
and only because of this,
yeah.
you're able to grow
Yeah.
as a human being
Yeah.
in terms of your vision,
Yeah.
things of the
It would
world,
be
of your own
interesting
life.
to explore whether, during those critical processes, those crisis moments, whether you are actually, changing or transforming yourself into somebody else, or whether by contrast you have discovered who you really are, right? What are your deeper concerns, your deeper, fundamental concern. I mean, it sounds very psychoanalytic, but I think there is a grain of salt in that. I mean, it seems that, in fact, going back to what you, Giuseppe, said at the very beginning, we live. I mean, society imposes on us all sort of standards and all sort of evaluations, and then at some point, you realize, well, why at all am I acting the way I'm doing? What is it that motivates me? What are the fundamental reasons that drives me? And you find out, maybe, precisely in those processes of crisis, that or self-doubting,
Mhm.
that in fact those standards are not your standards. They are not. You don't want to live
Exactly.
that life.
Exactly.
That's why I think a very important point probably now is to say, because before there was a question, what is a self in general,
Yeah.
but what you judge when you self-doubt,
Yeah.
a part of yourself that is probably not so important, like some social standard that you impose yourself,
Right.
or really your entire personality. So one of the interesting output of the process of self-doubting in the crisis, for example, is the fact that you are almost obliged to recognize what is essential to you.
Yeah. Exactly.
So because there is the problem, probably.
Right.
Not really, because if you understand that some aspect of you, okay, you can judge, you can doubt this aspect, but they are not so important. Finally, it's no problem. Self-doubting. Self-doubting is a really crisis when you recognize that what you doubt is something really essential to you.
Exactly.
For example, that touch your identity.
Right.
I don't want to now introduce the question of identity. It's too
Yeah.
delicate. But for example, I for the question of crisis, I was thinking about 2 things, 2 examples also. One is the job. For example, the situation when you change or you decide to change job. I will say not just change a job, but change a career.
Yeah.
For example, you are a philosopher, you spend 20 years doing philosophy,
Right.
and then, as happened to not you, Alessandro, but all of us three. Okay, you decide. Okay, no, I change. I do something very different. And in this moment, in this crisis, why this crisis is very important? Because job and your career and your motivation in working is very important. It's not just a little thing of your existence. So I don't want now to say what is the self, but of course, for example, the work is a very important aspect of our personality. So this kind of crisis, the crisis of changing career, for example, is really a moment of self-doubt.
Absolutely.
We can say that's a good example.
But here's another. Sorry, you wanted to say something?
No, I just wanted to say that's why it's very important also to end the process of self-doubt.
Right.
In order to
get a better judgment. So here's another example. Suppose, you know, this it's not only about, I think, who you really are. I mean, of course, there is a sense in which we can define that questions in purely individualistic term, but there is also a way in which, I mean, suppose you have to make a really big life decision about, say, your career, right? And pursuing your career would have meant for you to say move to a different country. But you know, you have attachments. You have a family. You have a daughter. You have a wife, and this person live well in the place where you are. So what do you do? What is it? How do you solve the dilemma, right? And there, I mean, answering that question reveals to you what are really your priorities. You're saying, okay, no, you know what? I'm committed to them. I have these attachments. They are part and parcel of who I am, right? It's important to them to stay in this country. I will give up on my career or something like. Or rather, you say, you know what? Yes, of course, these persons are important to me, and their well-being is so central to my life. But I'm striving towards, I don't know, higher epistemic ideals. So career is just a means to say, write the book that will change or revolutionize, I don't know, philosophy for the next decade or something, right? And then I think how you solve that dilemma, that crisis, I think tells you something.
It's exactly the fact that you are obliged, in this situation, you are obliged to fix the priority and to say, okay, probably career is not so important. You discover even that probably the career or philosophy is not so important. It's more important that your relationship with your wife and your daughter is good. And so you say, okay, now I stay here. Yes. But the interesting point, I think, is the fact that you are in this situation, you are obliged to sort of take the decision or to see clearer the situation. Yes. And for me, another example I would like to bring to the table is the gender question, because I mean, for example, in this moment, for my job, I do a lot of interviews with trans persons. Yeah. And that's very interesting to hear the stories of the trans person, because for in this sense is a way to answer your question. I mean, you Alessandro raised before. So the question, okay, when you do this transformation, when you enter this process, are you recognizing something that you was already there, or are you really changing?
Right.
And I mean, with the stories of many trans persons, that's an open question. Yeah. Because there are some people say, okay, I discovered something new, but the most of them actually they say no. Actually, the self-doubting process was a way to discover who I am. Right. Really. So. Right. And that's interesting because in this case, self-doubt is not a way to go to another direction, towards another direction, but it's more a way to reveal yourself, that probably the self that the picture of yourself that you had before was not the good one, or the one with which you were satisfied.
So when you were saying discovering, you meant, exploring something new, right? No, but I think I'm perfectly in line with you. I think I would say discovering who you are in the same of, gnosis auton, to know thyself. So to come to the moment where you say, okay, this is the person who I am now. I see that clearly. I didn't before that. You know, the image that I had of myself was opaque, was not transparent, because it was infiltrated by all sort of expectation from society, expectation from other people. But now I really see, okay, this is me. I base my decision on that, and in that sense, I have discovered my true self, whatever that exactly is.
I mean, it's a kind of hard question.
Yeah.
Who am I really?
Yeah.
I mean, is it a possible question even?
Yeah.
I mean, how can I manage to find out?
No, yeah, but
how
you know,
I
I think
really?
I think your
That's
decisions,
weird.
your actions. No, you don't know. I mean,
exactly.
there's
Maybe it's
yeah.
not an epistemic question,
Yeah.
like
No,
more
no.
on the moral
Yeah.
side.
Yeah, you know the thing that you do, you think that maybe you confess to others, the things that are really important. Those reveal to you who you are. Of course, nobody knows, that
No.
before acting or making decisions, right?
Because maybe also, the self is part of. I mean, I'm thinking about Wittgenstein right now. I mean, he says we have a background of beliefs that are beyond doubt.
Yeah.
And the self in itself somehow is something beyond.
Right.
I mean, it's part
Right.
of this background.
I mean, I
things.
think when you start questioning that stuff, when you start to question those hinges propositions, those beliefs that are so
primitive.
so primitive, then I think, I mean, if you really do that in not from a purely abstract point of view, from a philosophical one, but when you start to question them existentially, I think then you are moving towards an altered state of a psychopathological potentially. I mean, it is something that is observed, for instance, in schizophrenia, that they have anomalous self-experiences, so they constantly questions all those commonsensical assumptions that we do on an everyday basis. So, for instance, they start questioning, am I really a member of the human species, or am I not, say,
really radical, fundamental.
yes, yes. No, I mean that's. I think self-doubt in that specific sense, that goes, I think.
Can drive you crazy.
Yeah, exactly. That goes in a. I mean, when you take that seriously, right? Not from a purely philosophical or epistemological position. When you take that seriously, I think that leads you in territories that are more close to psychopathology, right?
Yeah.
But yes and no. I mean, I would like to resist this because I mean, exactly these fundamental questions, they are the fundamental questions that are raised by philosophers. I mean, Augustine, Descartes.
Right,
I mean, they just try to explore,
but
self-doubt in a radical way. What means radical means exactly speaking in terms of very fundamental aspects. So even to doubt about the grammar of your existence.
Right.
So,
but
and in this sense, probably no. You want, Cristina?
I wanted to resist this idea that we can define the self.
Yeah.
So, like Descartes, in the end, he defines the self, like res cogitans. So, something that.
So you are more in, if you understand well, you want to say that sort of never-ending process?
Yeah, in the end. And I wanted to criticize the idea that we can define the self, and we can even ask the question about what is the self. And maybe considering that is a concept that is beyond doubt, in some sense, which is I mean.
Yes, of course. Yeah. No, I mean, I guess, I mean, philosophically we can debate, right? And people have debated for centuries on that. But I think, and to go back to your point, Giuseppe, I think there is a very, there is a clear line that distinguishes self-doubt considered from a philosophical perspective. I mean, a doubt that goes into those fundamental concepts. And then there is this other form of self-doubt, which eventually impacts your action, impacts your way of living and inhabiting the shared world. And when, I mean, the second form of self-doubting, I think that is pathological. That hasn't anything
So
to do.
if you push very far this second,
Yeah, when you can't engage in a proper conversation with other people because rather than spontaneously talking to some, you constantly over self-reflect. Who am I? What am I saying? How the other is gonna receive what I'm saying? All that impacts the way in which you act normally, right? And that is pathological, I would say. Right.
Yeah.
I would like, I don't know if it's a good moment, I would like to propose something philosophical.
Okay.
But actually it's a little philosophical point, very simple, in order to introduce another way to think to the notion of self-doubt. Because actually, until now we speak of self-doubt in terms of activity. Doubting is an activity that we do. And the question of the self, of course, is difficult. We cannot define the self, of course. But one thing is clear, is that the self is the object of the doubt. I mean, when we spoke now about self-doubting, and what we doubt is something, and this something is nothing but ourselves.
Right.
So, and I want to, I think that we are legitimate to have some suspicion about this approach.
Right. The approach that doubting is an act.
The approach doubting, that if doubting is an activity, it has an object.
Yeah.
Is something that is directed to something, and
Yeah.
this something is exactly the self or ourselves.
Right.
And so I don't want to exactly to speak about the self now. This is a very, very complicated question in philosophy, but just to say, okay, if we accept that when we self-doubt, we have also reason to doubt that the object of doubting could be the self.
Right.
That means that in any self-doubt, there is at least two things.
Right.
When we self-doubt, we doubt ourselves,
Right.
but at the same time, we doubt of the fact that we can consider the self as the object of doubting.
Right.
So, I mean, that could be a bit tricky, but it's just a question that self-doubt
Right.
has also a second level, sort of meta level,
Yes.
where actually the very position of the self as an object,
Yes.
as the object of doubting,
Yes.
is put in question.
Yes.
And I want to do this point just to push you to another direction.
Yeah.
That is, okay, we can think self-doubt in this sense, but
Yeah.
we can also think self-doubt in terms of not doubting ourselves, but doubting by ourselves.
Okay.
So self-doubt, you can rephrase in terms of it's me that doubts.
Yeah.
It's me the person who doubts. So self-doubt not as doubting something that is ourselves, but self-doubt in terms of doubting the sort of spontaneity of doubting, so doubting by ourselves.
Right.
That's the point. And so I think just a very simple example. So, for example, let's say we are in this bunker, and I'm speaking now, for example, of the fact that it's raining in Venice. I mean, we don't see, we are in the bunker, so we don't see outside, but until some minutes ago it was raining, and we know the forecasts are all agree to say that there is rain today. Okay, I say this. And what happens, Lara decided to break the rule, and because it's one of the last session, and she entered the bunker, she comes in, okay, and we say hello, and I continue to speak about the fact that in Venice it's raining. And then Luigi says to me, hey Giuseppe, are you really sure that it's raining? Look, Lara is completely dry. So I look Lara, I saw that she's dry, and so I said, okay, but probably make the hypothesis to say, okay, probably she had a big umbrella, that's why she's not wet, and so, and they say, I think, okay, but where is the umbrella? I don't see the umbrella. Probably she let the umbrella outside, but then I think, no, outside is no way to let the umbrella because outside it is under the sky. So if it rains, you don't let the umbrella under the rain. So, I mean, this process that I'm doing is a process to doubt the fact that it's raining, and now there are two senses of saying it's me that doubt. If I say it's me, I can say in this situation, I can say, okay, I doubt myself, so I doubt by myself, and so it's me that doubt, even if it's Luigi that made me doubt.
Right.
There is a sense in which I can say it's me that doubt, because I mean, I do the process of all this reflection. But there is another sense that is the sense of Luigi. If Luigi says it's me that doubts, of course he has more reason to say this because he was the first that raised the doubt. Right. So, and that's for me it's an interesting point because the idea of self-doubt, of doubting by oneself, can be taught in two ways. A weak way, that of course we always think, we always doubt ourselves, or better, we doubt by ourselves. But there are some situations, like the situation of Luigi, that raise the doubts, that is really him that introduced the doubting. And so there is a stronger way to think that someone doubt by yourself, by himself, so by herself.
Right.
And that's I mean that's quite interesting because it stresses a very specific point, that is the spontaneity of doubting.
Right.
So the idea that I want to propose is that self-doubt in terms of doubting by oneself can be taught in terms of spontaneous doubting. That the fact that we doubt spontaneously. So spontaneously, and that's the last point I want to do, have also two aspects. One aspect is that, like Luigi, when he raised the question, are you sure that it's raining? Actually, he's an agent. He's the spontaneity of doubting is in the sense of agency, to use a philosophical word, but it's the sense that he is responsible. Is completely responsible of this activity, of this doubting. But you also can think of the spontaneity of doubting in another sense, that just to say that it happens. And because if you reflect, Luigi could also say, okay, but actually I introduced this, I raised this doubt, but it was so evident. The fact to see that Lara were not wet, it was so evident, that it struck me so clearly that it's not really me. I'm not responsible, me, Luigi, I'm not responsible of this activity of doubting. But actually, it's just because I had an evident reason to doubt. So the very responsible is the reason, is the fact that Lara is not wet. That is the reason. And so this example explains another aspect of spontaneity. Spontaneity is of something that is not subjective. Spontaneity of doubting is something that is impersonal.
Right.
And that's the last point. I mean, I did all this little philosophical argument in order to say that we can think self-doubt, if we think self-doubt in terms of doubting by ourselves and not doubting ourselves. So the self is not the object, but it's just the fact that we doubt by ourselves. This doubting actually can be considered as a spontaneous doubting in a non-subjective way, so in an impersonal way.
Interesting.
And that's for me, it's a very, there is a little step just to think that thing like an attitude. And that's the very point. That's why I started to say, okay, until now we spoke about adapting as an activity. I doubt about myself, of myself, etc. And I think it will be interesting to think self-doubting as something spontaneous that comes, there's a sort of attitude.
Right.
And it's not something that you start. There is not a moment when you start doubting. It's sort of attitude you always have. So it's sort of way of being.
Or should have.
Yeah, that could be a point. But what I wanted to propose that to think self-doubt as a sort of attitude, a sort of mode of being, a way of behaving, a way of an approach to things in general. So,
Right.
So probably you should rephrase in the sense that self-doubts are, I don't know, in adverbial
Right.
sense, to say, okay, I self-doubtingly think, I self-doubtingly see, I self-doubtingly. So that the self-doubt is sort of constant, exactly, attitudes is always present.
Right.
in our and that's why okay, there are two examples of this, and one is the sort of critical stance that we have but critical not in the sense that now I say, okay, I want to criticize now this, I don't know what it is, etc. But more in the sense, in the practical sense, that I have a sort of distance to things, and I have in all what I do, there is a sort of, I already put in question what I do, I already rethink the things, and I think it's very, very human.
Right. So let me try to understand. I think so. Is the idea that when you being in the world, being an agent, means also being susceptible to reasons. So and reason are something that comes, so to say, from the world. It's not something that you develop or elaborate. But so here, I think, I don't know. Suppose that I leave the room, and you ask me, why, Alessandro, did you leave the room? Did you leave the bunker? And I say, well, because as a matter of fact, it was very cold, and then the coldness was the reason for my action. Is that the so? And being susceptible, being open to those sort of reason, is this self-doubtingly attitude towards the world? Is this the idea?
See, it's the idea that in some way the reason. This is just an example. That when you have strong reason to doubt, you cannot say that. You are the
initiator of the doubt activity.
Completely responsible of this doubt.
Right.
And so doubting is sort of spontaneous activity. Actually not activity. That's why I speak about attitude, because it's not, you cannot describe as an activity, the classical activity. There is someone, a subject that's responsible, is doing something.
Right.
And for me, there are two aspects that are very important. One aspect is exactly that the agent is not completely there. I mean, it's there because, of course, we doubt things, but we don't doubt because we decide to doubt. There is not a moment we say, okay, now I doubt. It's something that comes, that happens. And the other aspect that is very important for me is that when you say that doubting is an attitude, you are actually saying that even if you doubt things, you doubt some situations, persons, yourself, etc. It's not so important. Actually, the fact that you doubt is not dependent of the object of your doubting. It's an attitude. It's always there. It's like the methodological. It's like the methodological skepticism. I mean, you doubt every time.
Right.
It's a sort of
It's true,
rules.
but not about everything.
Right.
Why not?
right?
Well, you won't doubt that if you open the door, there is an outer world.
Exactly.
Why not? I mean,
Well, that would be pathological. I mean, you could do that philosophically, but if you then, I'm opening the door really very slowly because who knows what is gonna be.
no, but of course we have to have reason to doubt.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't say that you can doubt out of nothing.
Yeah.
You have always reason to doubt something.
Right.
But the point is that that you doubt if you think self-doubt of doubting by yourself
Yeah.
or by oneself in general, you are just thinking as an attitude. This is something that you do always.
Right.
That's why I think more as a sort of state, self-doubting as a sort of state that you convert. There is a conversion. You do a sort of conversion and then you become a sort of doubting person. And you are always a doubting person. But that doesn't mean that you are undecided on everything, because exactly as an attitude, it's not just a question to be undecided. It's more a question. A good example, I think, is prudence. The old notion of prudentia in Latin, that actually is the notion of phronesis in Greek. This is a sort of moderation, a sort of wisdom, actually, a sort of something very different from being cautious, from having fear, or from fearing things, but more in the sense of taking critically things.
So it's not a self-defensive attitude, but it's a more engaging kind of
engaging.
proactive.
It's proactive and very practical, but in the sense that I'm in front of a glass and I reflect about this glass. I consider this glass in the circumstances where the glass is. I mean, that's wisdom. That's the older notion, Greek notion of wisdom. This phronesis, and then in Latin was prudentia, and this in this sense I speak of doubting as an attitude and self-doubting as a spontaneous attitude.
But not everybody is wise, right?
But that's why it's a conversion. I mean, if you enter this state,
Okay.
then you have all the time sort of a wisdom state. The state of wisdom is all the time you have a sort of distance, you have a sort of critical approach to things. But that does not mean that you really put in question the existence of all the
of
things.
any and everything.
Well, it has
Because
to be practical, right? It has to
Because in the spontaneity of doubting, there is the fact that it's not up to you to doubt, but it's up to the reason that comes to you
right.
Yeah.
So
that push you to doubt. I mean, there is always some reason to doubt, and they are the responsible of doubting. It's not you.
And differently from what we said at the very beginning, so it's an attitude which cannot be defined, I think, as far as understood, as a self-conscious emotion, right? So this
Right.
attitude of being,
Exactly.
of self-doubting, it's not an emotion. So
Right.
It's not emotion, it's an attitude. It's a sort of...
it's a more neutral kind. It's not a feeling, it's not an emotion, it's a more neutral kind of way of being
of
in
taking
the world.
things, of accepting
Relating to
the
the world,
happening, what happens, and the world, and so it's an attitude. Exactly.
It's more related to epistemology. Somehow.
Epistemology, I will not say in terms of theory of knowledge, probably more in terms of, no, I think more in terms of practical thinking. So the
It's like putting things into brackets, like a sort of epoche somehow. But that's too much, maybe.
no, I don't know, probably it's too strong to say, to put things in brackets, but it's more in the sense of a critical attitude, actually, a critical stance on things.
An antidote to arrogance
Yeah,
and
and I think
dogmatism.
why I was fascinated by this proposition. I was fascinated by this proposition because I think that even for a big question like identity,
So, yeah.
I mean, with this approach of self-doubting, we can consider even identity, even ourselves, as something very mobile, something that's not fixed for.
So,
I joined your point, Cristina, about the never-ending process. I mean, it is a never-ending process.
But then, what defines or what characterizes the the negative counterpart? Who is the unwise? Who is somebody I mean, what is it that makes somebody an unwise person, somebody who lacks wisdom or
The one
prudence,
who's
yeah?
not enacting this attitude, so, right.
But the one that never doubts,
Never doubt, yeah.
or the one that wants to doubt.
Yeah.
The one maybe who doesn't react to the reasons
Take
To
them
doubt.
for, yeah.
which
Yeah,
come
exactly.
from the context.
Yeah, they are not sensitive to the to the circumstances, for
Yeah.
example,
Right.
or exactly someone that want to actually to think doubting like an activity. That's say something that you start and you go through forward, and even having the expectation that you will finish the activity of doubting.
But then
That's
we're not so far from what we were saying before, as the way
No,
which we were
exactly.
defining self-doubting before. So it's a kind of existential process you have to go through in order to kind of gain a better understanding.
But I wanted to
experience.
introduce this because I think that with this point, you think doubting as a process that it necessarily never end, necessarily. And that's why you don't doubt because you want to get the truth. That's the point. I mean, self-doubting as an attitude that I'm proposing now is an attitude where you don't doubt exactly the unwise person, the person that is not in this attitude, is the person that decides to doubt because he wants or she wants to get the truth. That's the unwise person. The wise person, in terms of prudential reasonment, is the person that that always
It's a methodology,
put the
so it's
things
more
in
like-
question. So that is not necessarily the skeptical, the radical skeptical, but more the methodological skeptical.
Right, right.
Yeah, I would love to put an examples on the table, like in the creative process. I mean, self-doubt is really important when you want to also understand if your work has some artistic qualities. But still, and I was reading recently Virginia Woolf, who was really hypercritical maybe on her own works. And so she says, okay, I read my things first time, they're good. Second time, they're not too bad. Third time, oh my God, I will throw everything
trash.
away.
Yeah.
So the point is, okay, it's true. I mean, I agree with you, Giuseppe. Self-doubt is a process, and probably, I mean, should be a constant attitude because it brings creativity with itself, and it's against arrogance. So you're constantly aware of your limits and so on. But still, when you're in a creative situation and you need to, I mean, do you need to overcome also the self-doubt? So still, this negative side is still on the table.
I like to, put a period at the end of a sentence. I like to conclude the process and move on, right?
No, but
And then, of course, and then you re-engage again.
I mean, that's a very important thing is that what I'm proposing now is not hesitation. It's not. I mean, the state of self-doubting as an attitude is not exemplified by the fact of hesitating all the time about things.
Right.
I mean, you put the point,
Right.
but after a point, when you put the point, you already know that you are going forward and putting question your point.
Right.
That's the idea. The idea, the wise person is not the person that is constantly hesitating about things, is not able to take decision. It's not this. That's the bad, the sort of caricature of of the wise man. The wise man says something. Say, okay, I believe that is so, but in saying so, he's already thinking probably not. Probably I could find
Probably a new sentence will start. After
probably
the period.
after that I say this, probably I'm compelled by my attitude to search for some counterexamples.
Right.
But I think you can achieve this figure of self-doubt only if you think in terms of attitude.
Yeah.
So I was always suspicious about the over-dramatization of the example of self-doubt. It's like even in in Descartes and in the Cartesian way, so there is a subject thinking about existence, and then is it so this over-dramatization, behind this over-dramatization there is the idea that doubting is an activity, and so there is a subject, there is a responsibility, there is the self is an object, is something that is there, and I think it's very, very we can really doubt the fact that we can put ourselves there and doubt it. And so
No, I fully agree, but I don't think we are that far from what we were saying before, because I think I would resist what you were saying, that you know, in the other version of a self-doubt, as we discussed it before, there is a kind of happy ending, you know, like the truth at the very end.
okay.
I think we didn't say that. I would disagree. You know, I think when we're speaking about the self-development process, you know, the self-doubt that will bring to a process like a kind of growing process, more or less. But it doesn't bring there is a happy end or like the truth at the very end. I mean, it's a never-ending process anyway. So even like kind of a more existential understanding of a self-doubting, I think never brings to a truth. I mean, you have to start over and over again. I mean, you have to bring it always forth, this process, right? And I think this makes me think of something that me and Alessandro, we have been discussing it for a while, the notion of transformative experience, as it was stated by this American philosopher Lori Ann Paul in a book that came out a few years ago, and which was quite instrumental for me in this thing. So the idea that whatever happens in our life, I mean, as precisely the example of like having to move to another country, having to kind of engage with like key decisions, you know, like life-changing decisions, these can be defined as transformative experience, and you cannot predict or forecast foresee the outcomes of that.
Right.
You just have to give yourself to the process. I mean, she uses this amazing interesting word of revelation, I think, Lorian Paul, she says you cannot predict, and therefore you have to sort of go through the process and give yourself to the revelation that the process will bring for you.
Right.
So you know everything is going to change, there is not the truth at the end, but a revelation, meaning something that you cannot foresee.
Right.
And at the beginning, but there is definitely a self-doubt process, precisely because you're aware that you cannot fully foresee what's gonna be the outcome, the output of the process. Yeah?
It's actually a situation of being sensitive to also to difference, actually, to things that are different from what you think. Sort of be a sort of disposition to
exactly.
to sense, to see, to be open to what could be different, and so that could teach you something that you didn't imagine before.
Exactly.
So I mean, this is perhaps what makes our life worthy, right? If you could predict everything that will happen in your life, what would be the point of living a life? So maybe self-doubt is core to the words of our life.
And into freedom, because again, it's about cyborgs. I mean, cyborgs, would be able maybe
or robots,
they would think they are able to predict any and everything. And, so
they don't know any revelation.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's such
And
such an
again,
interesting word,
we are using words coming from the religious lexicon. This is interesting. I mean, we were talking about confession, then about conversion, and now
Revelation.
about
Yeah,
revelation. So self-doubt is really engraved into this
So true.
context somehow.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right.
I discovered that in this figure of prudentia, the Latin figure of prudentia, the wisdom, in this sense I wanted to think self-doubt as attitude, the symbols that are used in the iconography of prudentia, well, they are different, but one of them is a woman with two symbols, that is the snake and the mirror. And I found very interesting. Of course, the snake have many meanings, but one of these is transformation. So the ability to be open to transformation. And of course, the mirror. I mean, that's prudentia. So if you start even from prudentia, you're almost obliged to to go to this reflection and to self-doubt, actually.
Right.
And I found very, very interesting that that's in the tradition. I mean,
Yeah, this
even
is an
in
amazing
the
image.
Renaissance, Renaissance, you see statue with Prudentia, and she has not always, but sometimes these two symbols,
snake and the mirror.
a snake and a mirror,
And
and I found very, very intriguing this.
Does she see herself in the mirror, or?
No, actually, the mirror is, I don't know, it depends. But an image that I have in mind, so I have not the image here, so I cannot quote exactly with the sculpture. So, but the mirror was not, because, I mean, in the classical iconology or iconography, if you look at the mirror, it's more Narcissus and the myth of Narcissus, so to look at oneself. But to have the mirror is more the possibility of, we can speculate, of course, because but you can speculate is more the possibility of reflect on yourself, but not actually Prudentia because she's the goddess who brings the mirror and the snake, so who brings transformation, who brings self-reflection.
Right.
And I found it very, very interesting that
absolutely.
wisdom in the sense of prudential reasonment, this attitude can
And what
could
about
be
the
expressed.
snake?
There are many meanings, of course, it's difficult to say, but one of these is transformation. Is the possibility
changes the skin.
that is typical from reason, that through reason you can change your mind, you can develop.
Right.
That was interesting. That was an interesting conversation. I think, yeah.
Actually,
We should definitely bring it
indeed.
forth. I mean, oh my God, we could release like a 500 pages book.
No, each of these
On
points, of
different
course, it could be
sides.
developed, but I mean, we touch, I don't know.
But
some-
it's beautiful to finish, I think, with this image of the mirror.
And the revelation.
And the revelation mirror, yeah.
Right. Well then, thanks a lot, guys, for this.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.
Thank you
It's
for sharing all
amazing.
this, for responding to the
And thank
invitation.
you again, Lara,
Thanks
for
again,
the
Lara. Yeah.
occasion.
We are all excited to kind of
Opportunity.
listen to ourselves and like see what's going to be the next output of the project. So maybe the book, maybe something else. Who knows?
We look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
guys.